Ever think about the different voices? Like all the different opinions and viewpoints that make up a big political party.
Yeah, it's like a big family reunion, you know? You
Exactly.
got your crazy uncles, your quiet cousins, and everybody's kind of jostling for attention at the dinner table.
Right. And today we're diving into one particularly fascinating voice within the Democratic Party, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett.
Yeah, and what we have is a really in-depth look at how she's become such a prominent progressive figure.
Okay, but here's the big question, and it's the one our source material really digs into. Does her very progressive stance, while it definitely energizes part of the base, does it also create serious challenges for the wider Democratic Party?
Yeah, that's the tension, right? So the analysis we're looking at really goes deep into her background, where her beliefs come from and what kind of impact she could have on the future of the party. And our mission today is to break all that down for you and help you understand the core arguments.
All right, so to kick things off, let's get a sense of Congresswoman Crockett's background, like where she comes from and how she got into politics.
So she was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. Working class family. Her dad was a police officer and her mom worked in education.
Interesting combination.
Right. And you got to think how those experiences growing up probably shaped how she sees like social issues and the justice system.
Absolutely, it's like that firsthand exposure, right? So then she goes on to study business at Rhodes College, and then she gets her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center.
And even back then, it seems like her focus was already leaning towards social justice.
Yeah, and she wasn't just studying it, was she?
No, she was out there in the trenches, working as a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights advocate. A lot of her work directly with marginalized communities.
So she really saw these issues up close.
Exactly. And the source suggests that this is where she developed her views on systemic inequality and really started to believe that the government needs to step in and do more.
Okay, so she's got this background of seeing these problems firsthand, and then what gets her into politics?
Well, she was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 2020, so
Right.
pretty recent.
Okay.
And she quickly gained a reputation for being a strong progressive activist and for having what the source calls a very uncompromising style.
Okay, so a fighter. And then that led to her election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2022, where she replaced Eddie Bernice Johnson in Texas's 30th Congressional District.
Right, so she's on the national stage now.
Okay, so we've got a sense of her background. But let's get into the nitty-gritty, her policy positions, which our source frankly calls radical.
Yeah, radical is the word they use.
So let's break down some of the specifics.
Okay, well, first, it's interesting how the source compares her to the squad. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush. So right away, they're putting her in that camp of really progressive lawmakers who are pushing for big changes.
Yeah, and the source emphasizes that her views often go beyond what most Democrats even consider mainstream.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with health care. Medicare for all and abolishing private insurance. That's a big one.
Huge. She's a strong supporter of a single-payer government system like what Bernie Sanders has been pushing for.
Right.
Now, the source points out that this is really popular with progressive voters who see healthcare as a right. But it could also alienate moderates and independents who worry about the cost and losing their private insurance.
Right. So right off the bat, you see that potential for division within the party
Yeah,
and maybe even some problems attracting voters in general.
exactly.
Now let's move on to criminal justice. The source uses some pretty strong language here. Defund the police and criminal justice extremism.
Yeah, they don't mince words.
So what's her stance on this?
Well, even though her father was a police officer, Congresswoman Crockett supports the defund the police movement, which basically means taking money away from police departments and putting it into social programs and community initiatives. And the source really highlights the criticism this position has faced. They call it politically toxic, especially after the Black Lives Matter protests and the rise in crime in some cities.
Right. It's a really tough issue with a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of strong feelings on all sides.
Definitely.
Okay, moving on to economic policy beyond health care. The source talks about wealth confiscation and extreme tax hikes. That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, this is another area where her views are pretty far to the left. The source says she supports a 90% marginal tax rate on the highest earners.
Whoa, 90%.
Yeah, 90%, and significant taxes on wealth. And they point out that this could scare away businesses and investors, which could hurt the economy and could also alienate more moderate Democrats who are more business-friendly.
Right, so again, you see that potential for division within the party.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift gears to immigration, always a hot-button issue. The source talks about open borders and abolishing IC. What exactly does that mean?
So she reportedly wants to get rid of ICE completely, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. She supports sanctuary cities, and she wants a broad amnesty for undocumented immigrants who are already here.
Okay.
And the source points out that this goes against a lot of the bipartisan efforts to strengthen border security.
Right, so she's not just disagreeing with Republicans on this one. She's also at odds with some Democrats who want to take a more moderate approach.
Right.
And lastly, the source touches on her foreign policy, calling it anti-Israel and anti-military.
Yeah, so they say she's aligned with some pretty far-left critiques of Israel. They even mention her connection to the BDS movement, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And she's also voted against military funding, which puts her at odds with a lot of Democrats who believe in a strong national defense and a close relationship with Israel.
So it seems like on a lot of key issues, Congresswoman Crockett's views, as this source presents them, are quite a bit to the left of what you might call the average Democrat. And that brings us to the next big question. How do her views affect her relationship with other Democrats, particularly those who are more moderate?
Yeah, the Democratic Party is like a big tent,
Right? A coalition.
Exactly. And the source argues that her very progressive stances are causing some friction within that coalition, especially with moderates who often represent districts that are more politically mixed.
Right. They're the ones who have to appeal to a wider range of voters.
Exactly.
Okay, so the source breaks down these potential disagreements into a few key areas. Let's go back to economic policy. They talk about socialism versus pragmatism.
Right. So they contrast Congresswoman Crockett, who they say wants these big sweeping socialist policies, with moderates like Abigail Spanberger and Joe Manchin, who favor more market-based solutions and a slower, more incremental approach.
Okay, and what's the concern there?
Well, the source worries that this sharp contrast makes the whole Democratic Party look too radical, too extreme, which could make them easy targets for Republicans, especially in elections.
Right, because the Republicans could just paint them all with the same brush.
Exactly.
Okay, what about law enforcement and public safety? They compare the defund rhetoric with a more moderate approach that focuses on reform.
Right. So the source says that most moderate Democrats support police reform, but they don't want to completely defund or abolish the police. They understand that people are concerned about safety and crime.
Right.
And they worry that Congresswoman Crockett's strong support for defunding the police could hurt Democrats in swing districts where voters care a lot about public safety.
So again, it's that balancing act between different priorities within the party.
Exactly.
Okay, the last contrast the source highlights is about how to win elections. They call it appealing to the center versus mobilizing the far left.
Yeah, so this is about how you win over voters, right?
Exactly.
The source says that moderates believe the best way to win is to appeal to the center to get those independent voters and even some moderate Republicans.
Right, go for the middle ground.
Right. But Congresswoman Crockett seems to be more focused on firing up the progressive base, getting them really excited and turning out to vote.
Okay.
And the source worries that this might alienate those crucial swing voters that Democrats need to win in a lot of places.
So it's a high-risk, high-reward strategy.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've seen how Congresswoman Crockett's views might cause some tension within the Democratic Party, but now let's zoom out and think about the bigger picture. Could her views actually hurt the party as a whole?
Yeah, that's the big question. And the source doesn't shy away from it. They actually ask straight up if her radical views could damage the party's chances of winning elections.
Okay, so what do they think?
They lay out a few major concerns. One is that she could alienate swing voters. They say that most Americans, even those who lean left, aren't really on board with what they see as full-blown socialism or extreme policies.
Right.
So if the Democrats embrace her positions, they could become really easy targets for Republican attacks, which could cost them elections, especially in those suburban and rural areas that are often the deciding factor.
All right, so it's about electability, whether they can actually win with those positions.
Exactly.
Okay, the source also talks about something called undermining party unity. What's that about?
Well, it's about the idea that a party needs to be united to be effective.
Right, to get things done.
Exactly. And the source argues that these deep divisions between progressives like Congresswoman Crockett and more moderate Democrats are making it harder for the party to govern effectively. They even mention that her faction has clashed with the party leadership, which could lead to gridlock and dysfunction.
Yeah, and divided party doesn't get much done.
Right.
Now, here's an interesting point. The source says that all this could actually help Republicans, they call it fueling GOP recruitment and fundraising. How does that work?
Well, the source says that Republicans are using figures like Congresswoman Crockett to paint the whole Democratic Party as a bunch of radical socialists.
Ah, so they're using her as an example.
Exactly. And that kind of messaging can really energize Republican voters and get them to donate money to campaigns. It creates this us versus them mentality.
Right, so it's like she's unintentionally helping the other side.
In a way, yeah.
Okay. And finally, the source brings up a really practical concern: risking key legislative districts.
Right. So the worry here is that if the Democrats as a whole seem to be backing Congresswoman Crockett's policies, it could hurt moderate Democrats who are running in tight races.
Right, because they could be tied to her positions even if they don't agree with everything.
Exactly. And that could cause them to lose their seats, which could mean the Democrats lose control of the House of Representatives.
So the stakes are really high.
They are.
Okay, so according to this analysis, there are some serious potential downsides for the Democrats if they move too far in Congresswoman Crockett's direction. Now let's get to the source's final takeaway. What do they conclude about all of this?
They come right out and say it. They say Jasmine Crockett represents the far left of the Democratic Party, and her policies are way out of line with what most Americans think.
Okay.
They acknowledge that she's popular with progressives, but they say her brand of radicalism is just too risky. It could alienate moderates, divide the party, and make it much harder for Democrats to win elections.
So they're basically saying she's a liability.
That's the implication, yeah. And they go on to say that if the Democrats keep moving toward what they call her socialist agenda, they could suffer some big losses, and we could see a long period of Republican control.
Wow, that's a pretty dire prediction.
It is. And their final thought is that the Democrats need to reject her extremism and go back to a more pragmatic, centrist approach if they want to win.
So a pretty clear message from this source.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at Congresswoman Crockett's background, her policy positions, the tensions those views are creating within the Democratic Party, and the potential consequences for the party's future.
Right, and it all raises a really interesting question for you. How do political parties balance the need to energize their base with the need to appeal to a broader range of voters?
Right, because you need both to win elections.
Exactly. And does this analysis give you a new way of thinking about those dynamics?
It definitely makes you think. If you're interested in exploring this further, we encourage you to do some more research on the different factions within the Democratic Party and the debates about where the party should go from here.
Yeah, you could also look at election results in different districts and see how those internal dynamics play out in real life.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, it's about who wins and who loses. And understanding how different voices within a party can affect those outcomes is key to understanding politics as a whole.
Absolutely. It's all about the interplay of ideas and personalities and how that shapes the political landscape.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Definitely.